On November 6, 1956, British and French troops stood at the Suez Canal. Militarily, the operation had not yet been lost. Yet London ordered a ceasefire. It was not an Egyptian counterattack that stopped the advance. The decisive pressure came from Washington, the United Nations, and the financial markets. That is what still makes Suez so unsettling. France and Britain did not enter the crisis completely unprepared. They knew at least some of the risks. London understood how vulnerable sterling, its currency reserves, and its oil supply had become. In Paris, Gamal's government linked the canal to the war in Algeria and to Nasser, whom it saw as a supporter of the Algerian independence movement. Nor could the American position be ignored. Eisenhower had no reason to protect a European colonial war, and still, the attack went ahead. The plan depended on speed. Israel would advance across Sinai. London and Paris would then appear as neutral peacekeepers, issue an ultimatum, and intervene. If everything moved quickly enough, the calculation ran, their opponents would have no choice but to accept the facts created on the ground. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal Company in July 1956, far more than a waterway was at stake. The canal was a strategic route between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, but it was also a symbol of political sovereignty. In Cairo, nationalization could be presented as an act of national self-assertion. In London and Paris, it was read as an attack on an existing order, on influence, reliability, and rank. For France, the crisis was more complicated. Suez had become entangled with the war in Algeria. Paris did not see Nasser merely as an Arab nationalist, but as a leader whose policies could further weaken the French position in North Africa. The French decision cannot therefore be reduced to colonial nostalgia. For Gamal's government, Suez was a security question, a matter of prestige, and, in a sense, a European question. Could France still act with a major partner, or had its freedom of action already become dependent on greater powers? But the world of 1956 was no longer the world of the 19th century, or even of the immediate post-war years. The United States was an ally, not a silent escort for European power politics. The Soviet Union viewed the Middle East through the wider struggle of the Cold War. At the United Nations, sovereignty and decolonization carried a political weight that could no longer be dismissed. The canal remained strategically important, but its meaning had changed. It had become a test of the emerging international order as much as an artery of the old maritime empires. The political anger of the summer produced a covert operational plan in the autumn. The coordination between France, Britain, and Israel is well documented. But coordination did not mean identical aims. Israel pursued its own security and military objectives. Britain focused on the canal, its international standing, and control of the escalation. France connected the blow against Egypt more closely to North Africa and to the desire to weaken Nasser. The operational idea rested on speed. A rapid military advance was supposed to create facts before international opposition could organize itself. Such thinking was not unusual during the Cold War. What made Suez exceptional was the extent to which the plan relied on political delay. If events on the ground moved fast enough, allies, opponents, and international institutions would supposedly be confronted with a finished result. Secret cooperation created another problem. The more a plan depends on concealed coordination, the harder it becomes to defend in public. A government may understand its partners militarily while being unable to support them openly in diplomacy. That contradiction was built into Suez from the beginning. Publicly, the intervention had to look like limited crisis management. Privately, some participants expected wider effects on power, deterrence, and perhaps even Nasser's regime. Not every expectation can be reconstructed with equal precision. The central assumption, however, is clear. Military pressure and diplomatic choreography were meant to force a political result that could no longer be achieved by ordinary means. Britain had an additional weakness. Internal documents show that the economic and monetary risks were not unknown. Sterling, foreign reserves, and oil supplies were already recognized as vulnerable. That does not make the operation irrational. It reveals something more sobering. The government entered a crisis whose dangers it partly understood, hoping that speed and determination would compensate for them. They did not. American policy was decisive. Washington opposed an escalation that looked like a colonial intervention, divided the Western alliance, and offered the Soviet Union a strategic and propaganda opportunity. This was not only a moral objection, it was power politics in a changed international system. The United States would not carry the political and economic costs of an operation it neither controlled nor approved. London and Paris had apparently assumed that the Atlantic Alliance would eventually absorb their disagreement with Washington. It did not. American distance was practical, not symbolic. In a crisis where currency, oil, diplomacy, and political legitimacy were intertwined, that was devastating. Without American support, a military operation became a political stress test that Britain, in particular, could not withstand. Soviet pressure made the situation worse and accelerated the move toward a ceasefire. Caution is necessary when judging its precise effect inside each cabinet. It is not always possible to identify one threat that determined one decision. But the broader conclusion is secure. Soviet threats sharply increased the danger and reinforced the impression that the attackers had started a conflict whose political limits they could no longer control. The collapse, therefore, did not occur in one dramatic instant. It came through a chain of losses. Political cover disappeared, economic security weakened, and the public justification became harder to sustain. The further the troops advanced, the clearer it became that the operation no longer had a viable political roof. What had been planned as a display of strength suddenly exposed dependence. The trap existed before the first shot because military success could not guarantee a political solution. Even if the operation moved quickly, one question remained unanswered. Who would recognize the result, secure it, and turn it into a stable order? London and Paris had no reliable answer. The canal could be threatened, occupied, or controlled. The legitimacy of the post-war system could not be maneuvered in the same way. France is especially revealing. Paris acted from a mixture of security concerns, the Algerian War, prestige, and the desire for European independence. That mixture made Suez a trap. The wider the objectives became, the less likely a limited military strike could achieve them. An attack on Egypt might pressure Nasser, but it could not solve the structural problems of French power in the Mediterranean. It could demonstrate resolve, but it could not build a stable political settlement. For Britain, the lesson was more humiliating. Suez showed that military instruments and imperial habits had survived longer than the ability to use them independently of Washington. Historians therefore treat the crisis both as the end of Britain's imperial freedom of action and as a demonstration of American primacy within the West. In Suez, those two interpretations reinforce each other. Suez was more than a failed intervention. It was a crisis of transition. Old powers were still acting with the tools and instincts of their former position, while the international order had begun to follow different rules. The result was a plan that looked coherent in operational terms, but led nowhere politically. No single mistake decided the outcome. Several miscalculations combined about the United States, the strength of the alliance, the value of speed, and the reach of military force in a world where sovereignty, public opinion, and financial power were no longer secondary concerns. Arrogance alone does not explain the outcome. France and Britain had armed forces, experience, and a detailed operational plan. What they lacked was the freedom to use those assets without the consent of the West's new dominant power. The attack did not remove Nasser. He emerged politically stronger. Britain had to confront how dependent its foreign policy had become on Washington. France drew different lessons and later pursued greater strategic independence. No empire ended at the Suez Canal in a single afternoon. Historical breaks are rarely that clean. But for a few days in 1956, the failure of an old idea of power became visible. Troops could still advance while the political position of their governments was already collapsing. That was the trap.